Lincoln, of course, recognized his sorry state, as did those around him, and the dangers inherent. In one of his deepest moments of sorrow, he wrote to yet another legal associate. He was not bashful about his depression. "To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or do better." This was Lincoln's first call to action. He recognized that he must overcome his depression if he was going to continue on. In his life, Lincoln would endure a long road of trials. He was tried by the deaths of those he loved most. His younger brother died when he was an infant in Kentucky. In 1818, when Lincoln was 9, his uncle and aunt, Thomas and Elizabeth Sparrow, and then his mother, Nancy Lincoln, all died in a wave of infectious disease that swept his community in rural Indiana. They called the disease milk sick, which would have been the salmonella or the bacterial meningitis of that day. The case is thickly announced to the dread of neighbors. When the individual is about to be taken down, biographer Schenck quotes in describing this disease, he feels weary, trembles, more or less under exertion, and often experiences pain, numbness, and slight cramps. Nausea soon follows, then a feeling of depression and burning at the pit of his stomach, then retching, twitching, and tossing side to side. Before long, the patient becomes deathly pale and shrunk up, listless and indifferent, and lies between fits of retching and a mild coma. Lincoln watched his mother suffer and die this way in their small one-room cabin. His older sister, to whom he was very attached, moved out of the family home when Lincoln was 17, only to die in childbirth the next year. The baby, Lincoln's nephew, was stillborn. A neighbor later recalled Lincoln's reaction to the news about his sister. He sat down in the door of the smokehouse and buried his face in his hands. The neighbor remembered. The tears slowly trickled from between his bony fingers, and his gaunt frame shook with sobs. Lincoln's trials did not end with the deaths of the three most important women in his childhood. His relationship with the men of his family was the second trial to be endured. His father, who was barely literate, never understood his son's literary bent. Lincoln would often wander away from his chores to read a book under the shade of a tree. He would get up early in the morning and read, steal away throughout the day to read, and read well into the evening by the fireside. To his father, stepbrother, and cousins, who expected to live and die laboring on a farm, this seemed beyond indulgent. It was wasteful, lazy, contemptible. His father, not generally harsh and abusive, would often beat his son for this behavior. Lincoln was lazy, a very lazy man, his cousin concluded. His neighbors agreed. He was awfully lazy. He was no hand to pitch in and work like killing snakes. Lincoln, for his part, rejected their way of life and their worldview. Such a distance came between Abraham and his father years later, despite pleas from his father, or from his father's bedside where he lay dying, Lincoln elected not to return home, and he stayed away too during his father's funeral. A third trial Lincoln endured was a terrible love life. First, there was Anne Rutledge. It is debated among historians, as it was among his contemporaries, whether or not Abraham and Anne were engaged to be married, but many believe that Anne was the love of Abraham's life. Rutledge was a very pretty girl, according to historian David Herbert Donald, with fair skin, blue eyes, and auburn hair. A neighbor remembered that she was as pure and kind of heart as an angel, full of love, kindness, and sympathy. Herndon later claimed that Anne was the only woman Lincoln ever loved. In the fall of 1835, however, Abraham once again was devastated by death. He lost Anne to typhoid, and afterward he endured a prolonged emotional collapse that we will revisit in a moment. Next, there was Mary Owens, with whom Lincoln had a love affair when he was 27. Abraham and Mary had an informal understanding that they would eventually wed. However, Mary went home for some months to her parents' house, and upon her return, Lincoln began having second thoughts. This isn't one of Lincoln's prouder moments. Biographer David Herbert Donald recounts Lincoln's response to Mary's eagerness to wed. He feared that her coming so readily showed that she was a trifle too willing. He began finding defects in her appearance. From her first visit to New Salem, he remembered that she was pleasingly stout, weighing between 150 and 180 pounds, according to contemporaries, but now she appeared, in Lincoln's words, a fair match for Falstaff. And Lincoln later recalled the transformation this way. This is horrible, but pretty hilarious. Now when I beheld her, I could not for my life avoid thinking of my mother. And this, not from withered features, for her skin was too full of fat to permit its contracting into wrinkles, but for her want of teeth, weather-beaten appearance in general, and from a kind notion that ran in my head that nothing could have commenced at the size of infancy and reached her present bulk in less than 35 or 40 years. He knew how to please a... Well, never mind. The two were separated by geography again for some months when Lincoln moved from New Salem, Illinois to Springfield. Lincoln took advantage of the opportunity to engage in a 6-month campaign to convince Mary, in writing, that she should break off the engagement. Out of a sense of honor, Lincoln couldn't bring himself to do it, so he wanted Mary to do it. She would not fit, he told Mary that she would be unhappy, uncomfortable, and poor in Springfield. She would not fit in. Their match would cause her great physical and emotional distress. You have not been accustomed to hardship, he told her, and it may be more severe than you now imagine. He ended his final letter to Mary saying, I am willing and even anxious to bind you faster if I can be convinced that it will, in any considerable degree, add to your happiness. Needless to say, Mary rejected Abraham's offer, and Lincoln, to his surprise, was devastated. In fact, it led him to believe that he actually was in love with her in the first place. He couldn't quite make up his mind. Next, there was Mary Todd, who had come to town from her home in Kentucky to visit a cousin. Lincoln and Mary Todd spent much time together, and she, a hugely ambitious woman, saw potential in Abraham's career, and she did most of the courting. Abraham, 6'4", and Mary Todd, 5, differed in more than height. One neighbor remembered that the two were not a congenial couple. Their tastes were so different. Herndon decided that they were polar opposites in, quote, figure and physical proportions, in education, bearing, temperament, history, and everything. Ever indecisive in love, Lincoln himself came to believe that they were a poor match. They were, in his words, not congenial and were incompatible. And so he broke off the engagement and was humiliated for it. After Mary Todd, Lincoln briefly courted 2 other women. First, there was 18-year-old Matilda Edwards, rumored to be a factor in Lincoln's break from Mary Todd. Second, after he was rejected by Matilda, he proposed to yet another woman, 16-year-old Sarah Rickard, who rejected his offer, in her words, because his peculiar manner and his general deportment would not be likely to fascinate a young girl just entering the society world. As we know, Lincoln eventually returned to Mary Todd. I feel like I'm reciting a soap opera here. As we know, Lincoln eventually returned to Mary Todd and married her, ending his tumultuous series of love affairs. The two, however, did not live happily ever after. Mary Todd also had a history of mental illness in her lineage, and she would eventually be institutionalized after she survived her husband and 3 of their 4 sons, all of whom died in childhood. Through Lincoln's trials, he had 2 severe emotional collapses that gave us a glimpse into just how profound his depression was. One of them occurred in the fall of 1835 after the death of Anne Rutledge, and the other in January 1841 after his separation from Mary Todd, and at a time when his political career appeared to be in shambles, and his best and closest friend, Joshua Speed, was moving back to his parents' home in Kentucky. In both instances, friends feared that Lincoln had lost his mind forever, and that he might commit suicide. Several later recalled hiding his razor blades and knives for this reason, and in fact a poem glorifying suicide appeared in a local paper and is widely attributed to Lincoln today. In both instances, Lincoln required considerable help from friends and even from medical doctors before he could recover. According to historian Michael Burlingame, Lincoln likely underwent many of the customary procedures of that time, including a painful regimen of bleeding, leeching, the application of heated cups to the temples, mustard rubs, foul-tasting medicines, and cold water baths. He made a public spectacle of himself, breaking down, crying, and talking of suicide. "For not giving you a general summary of the news, you must pardon me," Lincoln wrote to his law partner in the midst of his second collapse. "It is not in my power to do so. I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or do better." You heard that line earlier.